I just finished painting this section of guides today. I did my last four guides. I started them on Friday night, and so I got them done this morning, Monday morning, and it got me thinking of how I'm going to rate them when I go to use them in a game. And that's something I haven't discussed much. I talked about it briefly in my getting started video on rating infantry, and something I see with other people who build armies for the men who would be kings, and it's really up to everybody themselves, but I feel that people tend to overrate their units. And for me, the entry in the rule book for regular infantry, the baseline entry for the regular infantry, I consider that a very high standard. I would rate the good British infantry as regular. And typically units are going to go down from regular. So it's a 6 point baseline for regular infantry, and I rate most units in most armies as actually 4 point regular infantry. So I'll typically have them as poor shots or unenthusiastic. So if I were to do Afghan regular second Afghan war, that would rate them as unenthusiastic if they're the infantry, and I would also have them poorly armed because the majority still had rifle muskets, and at least with the Afghan infantry, as opposed to the Afghan regular artillery, the infantry weren't paid as regularly as the artillery. And so the soldiers were actually fairly well drilled, and their drill had improved by the time of the Second Afghan War, but they were not being paid regularly, and so that made them somewhat unenthusiastic. That's just an example. If I were to do Mexican infantry in the 1870s, late 1860s through the 1870s, I would probably rate them also as 4 point infantry because the enlisted soldiers were not paid regularly, were not paid well, they were not trained well, and sometimes, especially in the early 1870s, they could be poorly armed, and so you could even drop certain units down to 3 point regulars. Now, what makes them regulars is that they still are drilled, they still do fight, and they know how to fight with bayonets in close order. They can execute maneuvers, even if done badly, they are still regulars. And it got me thinking, how I'm going to do these guides, and they're one of the few units that I would actually rate as that I'd give my positive modifier. They'd actually become 7 point infantry, so I'd rate them as regulars and elite because the discipline becomes two, and the guides were known for their extreme discipline. If you read in the Chitral campaign, they actually crossed a river first, and they fought for an entire day by themselves and were able to withdraw in good order. And that you only do that when you have incredible discipline, and the guides had that. Another unit that I would rate higher than the baseline regular infantry would be Gurkhas, and I would probably give the Gurkhas would probably be 8 point infantry. I would give them elite and fierce. I wouldn't give them sharpshooters. I don't feel that the Gurkhas were especially good shots. Not from anything that I read. They shot as good as anybody else in the British Army, which was still a pretty good standard. If you read things about the British Army or the Indian Army at that time, they had a lot of inter-regiment, inter-brigade rifle marksmanship contests, and the 23rd Sikhs, in fact, tended to do pretty well in those contests. Something also worth mentioning is the sort of the situation in which you would use the unit may change the rating from game to game. And so using the guides as an example, if I were to play them in a large game with a bunch of other regular units, say I want to use this section I have with my five sections of men from the 23rd Sikh Pioneers, I would rate them as regular infantry and elite. However, if I were to use them in a game that wasn't so much a pitched battle, and I had maybe a few units of them, I might actually rate them as irregulars, so they can use the go to ground rule. So I'd rate them as actually 7 point irregulars, and I would add fieldcraft, and I would add well armed, and probably veteran, because the veteran would actually restore their discipline, and so would the well armed. So they'd still have the modern rifles. They would still have the same discipline as regulars, but the fieldcraft allows them to go to ground, and they would actually be able to better act as skirmishers. The guides are an interesting unit where, depending on the situation you would use them, you'd actually probably you'd want to rate them differently. You'd want to rate them as either irregulars or regulars, depending on the scenario. There's also another scenario driven, rating thing might be using regulars as an example. You might add fierce, you might add elite for a unit of say British regulars. The 66 foot would be a good example. Uh, at toward the end of the Battle of Maiwan, when they're fighting in the villages and they're making their last stand, they fight. It's unusual. It's uncommon how well they fight, and it's not to say that any other British soldiers are bad, but the 66 and Jacob's rifles and the First Bombay Grenadiers, any of those clusters of men that get driven up into the villages, uh, and as the battle starts to break down, those men are fighting for their lives, and they're fighting desperately, and they're cut off, and they're making their last stands. Where if they were in a scenario where they could have retreated, they probably would not have fought. They wouldn't have fought to the death, I don't imagine. And so, in a scenario like that, where the men are fighting for their lives, you could rate them higher than you normally would. And that's not to say that the men who escaped the Battle of Maiwand, who made the retreat to Kandahar, fought any less hard, or they were lesser soldiers, but they had a way to escape, and that battle sort of went sideways on them. And the men who got pushed up into those villages, they didn't have a choice. They couldn't leave. They had to fight to the death. Where the other men, they fought their way back to Kandahar. I think it was 60 miles, and the Afghans they didn't let them go 60 miles. Unharassed. They attacked them the whole way, and the cavalry did a good job, and even the infantrymen were still. It was a fighting retreat back to Kandahar, somewhat. I don't think it was a fighting retreat the entire way, but for a part of it, they did have to fight their way back. Some more examples may include the Shingani Patrol, or the men who fought the last stand at Little Bighorn. Those three companies, though not so much. Those men, a lot of them did try to get away if they could, at Little Bighorn. And kind of the same at El Sandawana. If I were going to try to replay a section of that battle, I might rate anyone who's mounted differently than dismounted, because, as we know, and not to denigrate the mounted men at Asandawana, anyone who had a horse left that battle if they could. Uh, the guys on foot, you fought to the end because they had to. They had no choice. They couldn't run away. Uh, and you see that throughout history. Even at Batio, the Marines, a bunch of them are on the reef, and they're sitting out there, and they describe them like turtles. You can see their helmets poking out just above the water. And the men aren't cowards, but they don't really want to go forward, because that's a long wait in, and their commander finally tells them, like, what are you going to sit here and do? You're going to die if you stay here, so you have to go forward. And so sometimes situations can force men to fight more fiercely, and fight to the death in situations that they otherwise may not have if they had a better option. And so those are just examples of where you could take soldiers and you could rate them differently depending on the scenario you're going to play them. And that's just something I thought of as far as rating. It said, but typically with regular infantry, I rate them lower. And just going back to the 23rd Sikhs, where it mentions in their regimental histories that they consistently won marksmanship competitions in the Indian Army. I don't know that I would rate the entire regiment as being sharpshooters for that. It probably was the same group of guys who kept going and winning. And so I was in the Army, and I was a pretty good shot with a pistol. I was okay with a rifle, and some guys were excellent shots, and a lot of the guys couldn't shoot to save their life. And so you may have certain individuals in a regiment that are very good, but that does not reflect the regiment as a whole. And not to say they were bad at musketry at all. I mean, Indian troops were very good. They were as good as British troops. The British and Indian armies as a whole had a very high standard for riflery. In musketry, they held it in pretty high esteem. Uh, American troops are sometimes described as being good shots, but in the 19th century, typically not. The U.S. Army in the Indian Wars period, for instance, you were allotted per man per year 3 rounds of ammunition to train, and so men that were good shots were good shots. Not because of the Army. They probably came in with that skill set because they didn't really practice shooting. It wasn't not really something that was done. If you watched movies, you might think different, like in Glory. And I love the movie Glory. It's a great movie. But you see them firing their Enfield rifle muskets, and they're practicing. Most guys in the Civil War didn't fire their rifle musket until they were in action. And there's actually some practice that goes on. I can't remember the account, but the guy was a veteran. He had been in campaigns before. He was like a 3-year man, and so like 2 years into his enlistment, they actually practice marksmanship, and he writes about it in a letter because it's novel. It's not something that was normal in the U.S. military at that time. Uh, and so that was kind of something, a kind of a tangent I went off onto the side. But yeah, that's something I thought of, and I want to keep making little videos as I get ideas. And so this was one. I don't know if this is a good idea if anybody cares about my ratings, but I do plan on using the Men Who Would Be King's rules to represent other periods that aren't colonial. So I'm working on an Austro-Prussian War of 1866 army that's going to be Austrians. I want like to represent the 79th Venetian Regiment. I think that'd be cool to represent. Uh, and those rules may not be these rules. The Men Who Would Be Kings may not be perfectly well suited to European conflicts, but I find, and I personally like skirmish warfare anyway, skirmish games anyway. If you can learn one set of rules like the Men Who Will Be Kings, and if I can play them for a lot of different periods, it just makes gaming easier, even if they're not perfect for every period. You know, anyone who does historicals tends to fumble around with 5 or 6 different historical games, and it just makes it cumbersome the game, and you're always checking back with the rules. Where, when I was a kid, for better or worse, I played a lot of Warhammer, and I played like every weekend, and you got good. You knew the rules. You didn't consult the book much, and the games they played faster. They were more fun. It was more fluid. Whereas, a lot of people I know that play Black Powder are constantly going back to the rule book because they don't get to play it much, and they play a few other systems for other periods. And so I just want to do the Men Who Would Be Kings as much as possible for my periods, and kind of anything where they have rifles or muskets, up until like World War I, and you could play it for East Africa easily. A lot of the technology employed in the fighting in East Africa wasn't much different than it had been in the early 1900s. And so that's my video. It went a little bit longer than I thought it would, but if you have any suggestions or you have any thoughts, please put them in the comments. I'm always looking for new ideas because I don't know what everybody else likes. I know what I like. And if anyone sees, if you can see well enough, tell me if the red coolers, if they look like they're highlighted, because I did highlight them, but I think the color I used was so close that it doesn't look like I did much with them. But I want them to pop a little bit. And so if you can tell from this video if they look good, please let me know. Thank you for watching, and goodbye.